Almost 1 year from the day that Lancelot and Maligant had fought, Maligant sat on his horse before Gawain in Camelot. Gawain being the one who would fight him for Guinevere, in Lancelot's absence. No one had seen Lancelot in the year since he had fought for Guinevere's honor. He had left looking for Gawain and disappeared that day. The pair, Maligant and Gawain, were pretty evenly matched, and no one really knew who the winner would be. Then they heard the thudding of hooves on the ground. Before anyone knew what was going on, another knight had entered the battlefield in full, shining armor. He sat on his horse between Gawain and Maligant. He pulled off his helmet and threw it to the ground. It was Lancelot, back from the dead. We'll back up and talk about what Lancelot did over the past year. He disappeared just hours after he defeated Maligant the second time. He told Guinevere and Kay that he was going to search for Gawain, who still hadn't arrived after taking the underwater bridge to get to Bademagu's castle. Lancelot will be right back, he told Guinevere, them looking deeply into each other's eyes. With that, he left with a group of King Bademagu's knights. This is where things kind of start to go off the rails a bit. A few hours outside King Bademagu's castle, they saw an evil-looking dwarf riding a cart. Despite that really not working out well for Lancelot's reputation the last time, the dwarf promised to take him to a very wonderful place. And that's all he said, a very wonderful place. A very wonderful place sounding very wonderful. Lancelot went with the evil dwarf and was not seen by those men again. Those knights found Gawain bobbing in the sea, alive but just barely. He had failed in his crossing of the underwater bridge, and he had been adrift in the sea for a while now, his armor having rusted around him. They dragged him out, told him everything that had happened in the past few days, and they helped him back to Bademagu's castle. Everyone waited for Lancelot, with Guinevere, Kay, Gawain, and King Bademagu in deep anxiety. They were all surprised when an absolutely real message came from Lancelot at Camelot, saying he had just gone home and that everyone from Arthur's kingdom should come too. When they arrived, everyone was surprised and heartbroken to find that the message had been forged. No one had heard from Lancelot for weeks. After the evil dwarf rode off with him, kids, that's why you don't get into a car with an evil-looking mythological creature, even if he promises to take you to a very wonderful place. Life went on in Camelot, with Guinevere in a deep depression over the disappearance of Lancelot. Guinevere, though, having a husband and a very handsome knight on the side, was not the only one with too many choices. The well-to-do young women in the land wanted to get married, but there were simply too many talented, brave, and good-looking men. They lighted on a solution. They would have the men fight it out, and they would pick whomever was left standing at the end. The women scheduled a tournament. Like I said, Lancelot was a captive, and it should not surprise you at all to learn that it was Maligant who had arranged the evil dwarf driver and his vague promises. Lancelot was just shut up in some manor somewhere, though, on the estate of one of Maligant's lords. Maligant barely stopped by, and one time when the lord was out, the lady of the castle brought Lancelot his food and casually mentioned the tournament. Despite being in love with his king's wife, Lancelot knew he must go. Not because of the young ladies, though, but because he knew Guinevere would be there. The lady of the castle said, "Well, you're supposed to be a captive. If I let you out, you have to promise to return after the tournament, and also give me your love." Lancelot said that as long as he was permitted to go to the tournament, he would come back and give her whatever she wanted. She lent him her husband's armor, it was bright red, and said that it was obvious that he was in love with someone else. But she would take whatever scraps of his love that she could get when he returned. Yeah. He went to the tournament and did amazingly. So well that Guinevere began to think it was him. She sent a servant to this mysterious red knight, who told him to, quote, do his worst. And that does not mean what you think it means. She wanted Lancelot to throw the match. Hard. And he did. He ran from battle and did so poorly that he was the laughingstock of the whole tournament. 2 days of this passed before Guinevere told him to do his best. And he did. Beating everyone. This confirmed in her mind that this was Lancelot. He was alive, and he would do whatever she wished. Unfortunately, when the tournament was over, he had to return to prison. He had sworn to this, even though it was a really unjust captivity and all that. As soon as the last night was down, he leapt the fence with his horse and rode off into the horizon. The young women who put on the tournament to find a husband had just watched all of their other prospects being humiliated on the battlefield, and they decided that if they couldn't have this mysterious red knight, then they wouldn't have anyone. They all agreed not to marry anyone for a year, and that June presumably devastated the Camelot wedding industry. And yeah, if you're wondering how Lancelot beat scores of armed and armored knights in a battle royale, yet was captured by one evil dwarf, well, I'm pretty sure you just gave more thought to his captivity than the writer ever did. Malagant, when he learned that Lancelot had been let out and had returned, was very unhappy that his jailers were not doing really the one thing that defines a jailer, not letting the prisoner go just because he promised you he would return. Malagant built a tower by the sea, had Lancelot put in it, and sealed the door. He paid random servants to come and throw stagnant water and moldy bread in the high window once a week, no one really knowing that Lancelot was inside. It was a year after their first fight, and Malagant showed up at King Arthur's court. Oh, Lancelot isn't here? Where could he be? Looks like I get to take Guinevere based on our totally reasonable agreement. He didn't go unchallenged, though, and Gawain said that he would fight the knight in a month's time. If Gawain failed against the muscly-footed knight, then Guinevere would leave with Malagant. Guinevere still not getting a say in all of this. Malagant went home where he bragged to his father that Arthur's court was afraid of him, and that he would be coming back with a famous queen here soon. There was one child of Badamagu who was sympathetic to Lancelot, Malagant's sister, who was not a fan of her brother kidnapping women, and, as it turns out, she was actually the young woman that met Gawain and Lancelot on the road in the last episode, demanding a promise of them. They rode off before she was able to ask it, but now she had a feeling that her brother might have kidnapped Lancelot. Long story short, she spent the next 3 weeks combing the land, looking for the very handsome knight, and eventually saw the tower by the ocean. She yelled in the window and found that it was the severely weakened Lancelot. She apparently had a pickaxe in her inventory and tossed it in the open window. He hacked his way out the bottom, and she took him to one of her castles where the staff could be relied upon for discretion. It said that she too fell for him and bathed him because Lancelot, and then he realized the date. He was supposed to defend Guinevere a month ago. The sister laughed. Oh, you poor, ridiculously handsome fool. No, Gawain is going to fight him. Tomorrow. Lancelot insisted on going, despite his weakness, and the sister outfitted him with armor, weapons, and a horse. He rode for Camelot, unsure if he would make it in time. But as we saw, he did make it in time. I mean, you saw that a few minutes ago when I did the whole Tarantino thing and showed you the end first. There, before King Arthur, Kay, Guinevere, Gawain, everybody, Lancelot revealed himself for the first time since he fought at Badamagu's castle. Lancelot was seething with hatred, and as he looked on Malagant before him, hated by the world and even his own family, and all the destruction their pointless fighting had brought, Lancelot decided that he hated Malagant even more, and that this guy needs to die. He told Gawain to please exit the field. He, Lancelot, would be fighting the evil knight. Malagant shouted taunts at Lancelot, who just sat atop his horse, waiting for Arthur to start the match. His blade was sharp and his lance ready. He got the word, and they started jousting. Their lances painfully exploded on one another's armor, and they were unhorsed, hitting the ground hard. In an instant, Lancelot was up, sword out, and hacking at Malagant's armor. It said that the hatred between the two fighters was so great that after they had been dehorsed, even their horses reared up and began biting and kicking at each other. Malagant blocked the hits as best he could, but fighting Lancelot was nearly impossible. Lancelot blocked Malagant's shots seemingly as soon as he thought of them. The kid wouldn't let up, and Malagant stumbled backwards and fell. He knew that if he was going to survive, he would need to get up, and then he saw his opening. He kicked Lancelot's feet out from under him, and the young man went down. Malagant jumped to his muscly feet, but he misjudged this kid. Lancelot had already recovered, and he was already right there. Almost as soon as Malagant realized that he had left himself open, Lancelot was slicing upward, severing his right arm at the shoulder. Yeah, after way too long of a quest, a sword bridge, 2 fights for Guinevere, and a year in captivity, Lancelot was very much not messing around anymore. Malagant screamed a horrible, screeching cry and grabbed the stub that was pouring blood out on the ground. Whether he thought it was just a scratch, or he was so beside himself with rage that he just didn't care about his own life anymore, Malagant charged Lancelot, and Lancelot could see his eyes filled with anger, malice, and hatred behind the armor. For someone as skilled in battle as Lancelot, dwarf kidnappings notwithstanding, fighting a one-armed opponent with no sword was about as easy as it got. He dodged the wide swings from Malagant's left hand and buried his sword in Malagant's neck. Blood gurgled up into his enemy's mouth, and Lancelot was surprised that he kept fighting. He finally stopped when Lancelot pushed his sword all the way through and completely separated his head from his body. Lancelot stood, took off his helmet, and wiped his face. It was over. He looked at the cheering crowds, but there was only one person he was looking for. She was sitting next to the king, her husband, her face streaked with tears of joy that he was alive and back in Camelot. Lancelot rode to his king, Arthur, and bowed low. When he stood, he didn't hear a word Arthur was saying to him. He was looking at Guinevere as best he could out of the corner of his eye, as she stood next to her husband. Finally, it was time to talk to her, and he saw her restrained and cordial. She looked deeply, briefly, but deeply into the eyes of Lancelot, her knight, and told him thank you. She asked that he stay in Camelot for a little while now, and he said that he would do anything she asked of him. She smiled a polite smile and said, I know, and told her husband that this young man, Lancelot was it, would make an excellent addition to his round table. Another night approached Arthur, which left Lancelot and Guinevere effectively alone in the middle of a crowd. Lancelot looked at her. He needed her to know that this wasn't over, at least not for him. He loved her, and he would find a way to be with her if she wanted. As if she could read his face, she gave him a wink and spun around. As she did, her hand grazed Lancelot's, and his heart jumped. He watched her walk away and join her husband, the king. This was going to be tricky.